Hi, I'm really glad to be here today with Robert Jensen. He is a retired professor from the University of Texas, and his two most recent books are The End of Patriarchy, The Radical Feminism for Men. And the one that I want to focus on today in our interview is called Getting Off, Pornography and the End of Masculinity. This one's out of print. The publisher went out of business, but you can get a free PDF of this, which I'll post in the notes after, as well as a link to Robert's website and more information. Roberts was a journalist as well before being a professor, and has been writing and teaching about these topics for about 30 years and is now retired, but he very graciously agreed to speak with me today. We were both speaking at the Canadian Summit of Ending Sexual Exploitation just a few weeks ago, I think, Robert. Mm-hmm. And I had read this book several years ago, and man, it's powerful. It was a real a gut punch to me, and it really gave a new and interesting perspective on porn, what porn is, and what the way that intersects with men and masculinity, and how it serves as a mirror, and a lot of really interesting questions. So I just want to start off, Robert. A lot of people don't really understand when I say porn, what we're actually talking about here. Okay, so the porn industry in the last 20 years has grown probably faster than anything that has ever been created in the history of humanity. There's literally millions and millions and hundreds of millions of videos, pornographic websites, and I believe that the money it takes in exceeds the revenue from the NBA, the NFL, baseball, and hockey all put together. And I think in terms of the hours spent, it would be safe to say it may be the most popular pastime that people have. So the growth of the industry has been staggering. And I think about this all the time, and we're going to get into this. I want to hear your ideas on, like, what the hell happened in the last 10 years and why are we here? Yeah. But I would just love to hear you talk about what led you to write the book Getting Off, and maybe just talk about your experience of that, and give the listeners an idea of, you know, what you cover in the book and what that was like for you.
Yeah, great. Well, looking forward to the conversation, Paul, because this is really important. Let's start maybe by dispelling a myth about contemporary pornography. Sometimes when we critique porn in the porn industry, we're told, oh, come on, there's always been porn. And that's simply not true. Yes, human beings have depicted sexuality, represented ideas about sexuality as long as there's been, you know, human creativity and art. That's true enough. But there's a big difference between, you know, a statue of a sexual image from 4,000 years ago, and an internet that's easily accessible to everyone with graphic, sexually explicit depictions that eroticize domination and subordination to a new degree. So there's always been a human curiosity about sex. That's not surprising. And as long as we've had a creative capacity, we've told stories about sex through art and literature and all sorts of things. That's true enough too. But the contemporary pornography industry is something quite different. And I think that's where we have to start, to dispel this notion, oh, that this has just always been a part of the human experience. Now, to your question, how did I get involved in this? Well, you know, I was a working journalist in the newspaper industry in my 20s. And at the age of 30, I decided to go back to graduate school because I thought it'd be fun to teach college. Turned out I was right.
You were right. Okay, good.
Yeah, it's great fun to teach college. I enjoyed it very much.
That's a heck of a gamble. Let's go back to school at 30 and hope that works out, right?
So I was interested in freedom of expression, the First Amendment in the US Constitution. And one of the big issues in the late 1980s when I went back to graduate school was an emerging feminist critique of pornography and the legal and political implications of that critique. Now, this is separate from a more traditional conservative, often religious critique. It came out of feminist roots and concerns for men's systematic violence against women.
Okay, yeah,
Okay.
because sorry to cut you off, but I think at that time in the 80s, there was sort of this Larry Flint and Hustler and Jerry Falwell, the moral majority, and that was the context of the maybe the only conversation happening in the culture. And I think the only critique, if you want to call it, against pornography was based on religion and morality. Would that be safe to say? But you were looking at it from a different perspective.
Right, you're absolutely right. When pornography kind of moved out of the shadows in the post-World War II era, that is when pornography became a little more mainstream. This really took off in the 1960s and 70s. You mentioned Larry Flint, the publisher of Hustler magazine. Of course, you know, Penthouse, Playboy, Hustler, back when print dominated, Hugh Hefner, Bob Guccione, Larry Flint. These were the names of the prominent pornographers. And as you point out, it was largely a liberal versus conservative debate back then, with the liberals arguing for sexual expression and freedom of speech, and the conservatives really wanting to impose a specific moral judgment about what was appropriate sexually. All right, well, in comes the feminist movement in the late 60s and the 70s, and it really explodes that dichotomy. And it says, listen, we're not here to make subjective moral decisions about what is good or bad sex. People will differ in their opinions about that. The feminist movement said, we're here to point out the systematic harms to women, girls, and children more generally in an atmosphere in which men's claim of a right to sexually use and abuse women and girls has to be challenged. And they correctly, I think, identified the growing pornography industry as one place where that, what we could call a domination subordination dynamic, where men dominate and women are submissive, that domination subordination dynamic was being sexualized and eroticized and sold by these pornographers. So the radical feminist movement came in and really challenged the liberal conservative debate and said, let's focus on the real world harms to women and children. And those harms were to the women used in the pornography industry, and also to women who are subject to male sexual abuse, where that abuse can be connected to the use of pornography. Okay, well, this was a big debate back in the late 1980s. And it's what got me interested in it, first in a kind of theoretical way from a freedom of speech perspective. But like many men who grew up in what I call the post-Playboy generation, you know, I was born in 1958. I'm 62 as we're talking about this. I was born into that world where there was an increasing availability of pornography. All right. And I had used pornography as a boy and a young man in ways that are pretty typical in the culture. And so I came into the study of this issue assuming that liberal free speech, sexual expression perspective was the appropriate one. What changed that is I actually started listening to women and reading the work of women. So the key figure here is Andrea Dworkin, one of the really, you know, revolutionary voices in what we call second wave feminism in the US.
She's a powerful, right? She packs more in a sentence than some people do in a paragraph or a page. Eh? She's like the Nietzsche of feminist writers. You know, she just boom, boom,
I highly recommend it. You know, I do hope people read my books. I'm happy when they do, but in some ways, it's much more important to go back to those foundational books. And Andrea Dworkin is really at the heart of this. I always recommend her book, Letters from a War Zone, which is a series of essays and speeches that really capture the power of the feminist critique. And it's not just a critique of pornography, it's a larger feminist critique of men's sexual exploitation of women, of sexual violence. These are all tied together. The original feminist movement that pioneered this critique of pornography came out of activists who were struggling. And remember, this goes back to the 60s and 70s when there were no rape crisis centers. There was no awareness of sexual abuse in the way we are aware now. These were the women who created that movement. And one of the aspects of that was a critique of pornography. And Andrea Dworkin was the most powerful person to articulate that critique. Okay, so I not only started reading that work, but I met local activists who were working on the issue. And all of a sudden, I realized that I had been socialized as a male to expect to be dominant in intimate relationships. I had used pornography, which had reinforced that expectation. And in ways I was not aware of, it had shaped the way I had thought about men, women, sex, and power.
So,
And
okay, I have a quick question for you.
sure.
So when you were, let's say, told that you had been socialized in a certain way, how hard did you intuitively know that right away, or was this a process of, like, you know, I'm thinking of, like, even myself and some of the men I work with, I compare it to waking up, you know, and sometimes this is like months or even a year or two. I'll see guys over a couple of years, you know, go through that awareness. So, right, you
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? Like, what was that like for you exactly?
Very much the same. You know, most of the deep truths we come to understand about ourselves don't come through epiphanies, don't come from a light bulb moment where suddenly we understand everything. That's really not the way human beings work. So it was over the course of about a year and a half,
Right.
that I really had to challenge myself. Now, I was lucky. I not only had a lot of great women feminist colleagues doing this, I had one or two really close male friends with whom I could talk through this, and that was really important to me. And so over time, I started to realize, oh, this critique is accurate. You know, just in terms of, you know, a description of the world, they were describing the world much more accurately than the liberal defenders of pornography were. The other thing, though, is it was not only a question of evidence and logic, of course. That's not the way human beings, you know, interact with the world. We're not calculating machines. The other part of it, as you spoke of, was a kind of intuition and awareness that this, in fact, did describe the world I had been socialized into.
Right.
And what I came to understand with the help of feminism was that this wasn't a threat to me. Right? We have to remember, feminism is usually presented to men as something threatening. Like, whatever it is, it's going to take something away from you. It's going to challenge you in a way that's awful.
So the feminist critique was not a threat to you. Is that what you mean?
It felt like it at first, of course, but eventually I came to understand it wasn't a threat. It was an incredible gift. And the reason is quite simple, because although I had been socialized into this, you know, dominant conception of masculinity, it never really worked very well for me. I never felt like I was man enough. Now, I had grown up as a short, skinny, very effeminate boy. And so I always thought, well, the problem was I was just the scrawny kid who wasn't, you know, who wasn't the stud, who wasn't the high school quarterback, who wasn't, although if we're talking Canada, the hockey player might be a better analogy.
Well, we do football here too,
Yeah.
but yeah, hockey, sure.
Yeah.
The jock, or just the jock kind
right,
of
right. And so
yeah.
that wasn't me. So I thought it was all my problem, that I was just really not man enough. But what I came to understand, especially from talking over many years to many men, is that no man really ever feels man enough. There's something about the competitive nature of masculinity in a patriarchal society. And I'm going to use the word patriarchy over and over again. And all I mean by it is a system of institutionalized male dominance. Like,
can you just expand a little bit on
Yeah.
that for those not familiar with
Yeah.
just take a minute or two? Yeah.
Sure. So patriarchy is a term, you know, that sometimes scares people, but I don't think it should, any more than the term, you know, white supremacy. The culture in the United States, Canada, and other places, we're starting to grapple with the fact that we have this white supremacist past, that people like me who were socialized into, you know, white society took some of that into our kind of our being, and we have to work really hard to try and self-reflect on that and go through that critique. Well, patriarchy is a term like white supremacy. It describes a system, a political system, and in this case, a system of institutionalized male dominance. Now, what form does that take? Well, first of all, the form changes over time. Nobody's saying that we're a patriarchy today, like the United States was in 1800 or something like that. It also varies from society to society. I would say the United States is a patriarchy. I would say Saudi Arabia is a patriarchy, but they look very differently. Okay.
Right.
So it changes over time. It varies from society to society. The radical feminism, and I'm going to use the term radical feminism to describe a certain perspective on how to understand patriarchy, I think really went to the core by pointing out that in patriarchal societies, men make two claims. They claim the right to either own or control women's reproductive power or own and control women's sexuality. Those are really the core concepts in patriarchy from a radical feminist perspective.
Okay.
That in patriarchy, men say basic, and when I say own or control, of course, at one point in history, it was literally ownership. Men claimed to own their daughters, their wives. Men claimed to own women in general. But now that's changed, but men still exert that claim to control. All right. So that's all, I mean when I talk about patriarchy. And when we look around, it's not hard to see that we're still a patriarchal society. We see women routinely bought and sold for sexual pleasure. We see women objectified routinely in commerce. And we see that in politics and business, while women have made strides at gaining access to positions of power, this is still a world run primarily by men. Okay. Now, I don't think any of that's controversial. I think it's just a description of a kind of basic reality. And that's all I mean by patriarchy.
Yeah,
and of course,
sort of a model that describes the world as it is, that fits in a sense, that explains certain things. So I know.
And there's a moral claim, which is that domination and subordination dynamic is unjust and unacceptable. And so a feminist critique is simply a challenge to institutionalized male dominance, and in fact, a challenge to domination and subordination more generally. Okay, so that's the work I ran into, now 35 years ago when I went back to graduate school. And as I said, it not only helped me understand how the world functions, why politics and business look the way they do.
Right.
It also helped me understand myself. So, I said I was not a conventionally strong, masculine kind of guy. And I thought that my struggles with the expectations around being a man were my own problem. And feminism helped me understand, no, it's not just my problem, it's a social problem. And what I came to understand, and I think this is really important, is, take the high school jock that I looked up to when I was a kid. I thought they had it all figured out. I thought they had this masculinity thing, worked out. And what I learned from talking to so many men over so many years is every man, and I think I can say this with 100% claim, every man I ever met at some point in his life felt like he wasn't man enough. That in patriarchy, men are set up not only to dominate women, but to be very competitive with each other. That domination subordination dynamic is about men dominating women, but it's also about men struggling then to be dominant in their relationship with each other. And that is an extremely harsh and depressing way to live. This is what people often mean when they use the term toxic masculinity, a masculinity that's all wound up in power, strength, control, and domination. Well, I don't tend to use the term toxic masculinity because I think that's just masculinity and patriarchy, right? Men set up to not only control women, but to struggle to control each other. And I think, the consequences of that are devastating. They're devastating for women, of course. They're devastating also for men, not in the same way, right? The injuries that women and girls suffer in this world are far deeper and more damaging than the injuries we men suffer. But we men do suffer in a sense as a result of patriarchy. right? I don't want to present a false equivalence. The experience of men and women are very different.
Mhm.
But I think that the reason to make this claim is because it helps men see that, again, feminism isn't a threat.
Mhm.
Feminism is a great gift to us, right? So, just to make it very personal, at the age of 30, when I went back to grad school, I was doing my best to be normal. I
Okay.
wasn't very good at
That's
it.
normal anyway, right?
Yeah, but I was trying to be a regular guy,
Regular guy, okay.
and it wasn't making me happy. Now, all these years later, I've abandoned the goal of being a regular guy. It doesn't mean my life is easy. I've had struggles that are just part of being human.
Right.
But I wouldn't go back to that space of trying to be a normal guy for anything. You could not pay me enough money to go back and abandon that feminist critique, because whatever struggles I've had in my life is deeper and richer than it was when I was, rejecting a feminist argument and pretending that patriarchy didn't exist. And so I guess, my pitch to men all the time is you're socialized to be afraid of feminism, but if you embrace it, you'll find a kind of a new world waiting for you. Now, that said, there are lots of different approaches to feminism these days. And so I'm speaking of the path I took. We're going to talk a lot about pornography today. There's a pro-pornography feminism. Feminism, like any movement, has gone in many different directions.
I was going to say, should we clarify between, not to go too far down this rabbit hole, but first and second, third wave radical feminism? Is it like, and there's this new movement, if you can call it that, of sex, like, so you hear these words, sex positive feminism, women that are proud of doing porn because it's sexually empowering, and they will identify as feminists.
Yeah.
So can you just clear up a little bit of that confusion real quick?
Well, I'm not sure I can clear it up, but I can
Okay,
try to explain some of it.
Or expand on that, because you
Right.
know more about this than I do. But I see Gail Dines, who's a colleague and friend of yours. She posts about this a lot, because I know it drives her crazy when she sees women who identify as therapists promoting their latest whatever, porn show or whatever.
Yeah. And when I said I can't clarify, it's often a confusing mess. So in the United States, we use the terms first and second wave feminism to identify the feminist organizing that eventually won the right to vote for women. Which
That'd be first wave?
That would be the first wave of feminism.
The right to vote. Okay.
From the 19th century into the early 20th century, and women won the right to vote in 1920 in the United States.
Right.
Feminism then, to some degree, went into a kind of hibernation. It emerged again in what we call the second wave, in the larger context of the social ferment of the 1960s and 70s, when it wasn't just feminism, it was civil rights and Black liberation, it was the American Indian movement, it was the critique of the Vietnam War. Everybody knows the 60s as a time of incredible activism. And one component of that was second wave feminism. Now, already in that movement, there were different points of view. As I said, I identify with the perspective that's typically called radical feminism, women like Andrea Dworkin, who made that point about men's attempts to own or control women's sexuality being the core. All right, but the debate, emerged pretty quickly. You'll hear people talk about third wave feminism, fourth wave feminism, postmodern feminism. There are as many feminisms sometimes, it seems, branches, as there are professors who write books about feminism. All right, so there's a debate, and one of the axes of that debate is pornography and prostitution. So people like me would use the terms pornography and prostitution, whereas other people might use the term sex work, asserting that somehow the buying and selling of women's bodies is just another kind of work. Well, there's a whole debate about that. But this is a debate that women engage in. And I learned from my early feminist teachers that the role of men in feminism is not to tell women what to think. The role of men in feminism is to hold each other accountable. So I have my own opinions. They tend to track with my, as you said, friend and co-author Gail Dines, who's a sharp, radical feminist critic of more liberal versions of feminism that celebrate pornography and prostitution. Okay, so what's my role in all of this? Well, my role is to ask men to be accountable. So some men will, as you point out, they'll look at that feminist celebration of pornography and say, well, if women like porn, why do I have to stop using it? Well, not all women like porn. In fact, I think the vast majority of women would prefer a world without pornography, would prefer a world without, being inundated with images of women being sexually humiliated, sexually degraded for the pleasure of men. Okay.
I would agree as well, based on
Right.
my experience. Yeah.
But often this comes up around the issue of choice. So men, when I critique pornography, I will hear men say, well, if women are choosing to perform in pornography, then who are you to say it's bad? Well, I'm not talking about women's choices. I'm talking about men's choices. And I always try to put the question back on men, right? So here we probably should talk a bit about what pornography actually looks like, because
Actually,
a lot of people,
I'd like to, if we can get focus on the
right.
What you discovered in writing the book about porn, and a little bit about your I think it was quite shocking and almost traumatic for you, some of the things you went through from what I'm reading in the book, and maybe share about that, and be clear, like, I guess maybe not terribly explicit, but don't be afraid to hold back, because people really need to know what's out there.
Yeah, and this is an important point, because we're not talking about porn as an abstraction. We're talking about, representations, graphic, sexually explicit material, which is made with the bodies of real people, especially real women. So we need to be clear. So we used to always say, this is not your father's pornography anymore.
This isn't Playboy. Yeah.
This isn't Playboy with a kind of, cheesecake shot of a half nude woman. The current pornographic industry, right, produces, as you pointed out, millions and millions of images. So you can find virtually anything in pornography you want to, but we want to look at the patterns. What are the dominant patterns in the pornography industry? And as I said, what it really is, and this is the insight that comes from Andrea Dworkin and other women of that era, is that pornography is not just sex on film. A lot of people will say, well, human beings are sexual, sex is natural, porn is just sex on film. What are you so excited about? What are you so worried about?
What's the big deal here?
What's the big deal?
Yeah.
Well, it's not just sex on film. As Andrea helped us understand, it's sex in the context, again, I'm going to use this term, of male domination and female subordination. It's the eroticizing or sexualizing of male power. Now, that doesn't describe every single pornographic image. It's the pattern that we're looking at. And Andrea, remember, was analyzing material from the 1970s when she first started doing this work, when pornography was, by comparison, relatively tame. The current flood of graphic, sexually explicit material available on the internet has proved Andrea right. So again, I won't go into great detail, because it can be difficult even to listen to a description of pornography, let alone have to watch it. But pornography, the mainstream pornography industry, and by that I mean, the people who make money by selling all these images for a tidy profit, they quickly exhausted what we might call a conventional sexual script. Oral sex, vaginal sex, the kind of thing that roughly at least mirrors the way most people are sexual in their everyday lives. And the porn industry started creating what I think are specifically pornographic sexual practices. In other words, things that you don't see in most people's everyday life. One is what is called a double penetration. And that's where a woman is penetrated anally and vaginally by two men at the same time. And it goes on from there, much more cruel and degrading and violent kinds of sexual activity, in which the goal of the pornography industry is to create a kind of maximal sexual excitement by tying men's sexual pleasure to power.
Mhm.
That's the core of contemporary pornography.
Mhm.
And, you know, you said it can be traumatic. It certainly is traumatizing for many of the women who are used in the production of that pornography.
Mhm.
I've interviewed a number of porn directors and producers.
Oh,
This goes
interesting.
back.
What did you learn from that?
Well, one thing I learned is that because these sexual practices so common in porn are so psychologically and physically dangerous, that women don't stay in the porn industry for very long. So one of the complaints, and I'll put that in quotes, that I
Yeah.
heard from porn directors and producers is that the women come and into the industry and it's so distressing that they leave quickly. So, you know, one guy said to me, you know, in the old days, you know, kind of the good old days, he was saying,
Mhm.
women would stay in the industry for a long time. You developed working relationships. You'd call a girl. And by the way, in the porn industry, they always refer to adult women as girls, porn
Mhm.
girls. That's the
Interesting, yeah.
jargon of the industry.
Mhm.
He said, you know, you could call a girl, you could use a girl in a scene and call her 6 months later and use her again. He said, now there's no guarantee anybody's going to stick around. And another porn director told me, listen, he said, the sad truth is this is an industry that chews up and spits out women at a pretty rapid rate because these sexual acts they're asked to perform are so, again, psychologically and physically debilitating and dangerous. Okay,
So I
that's
just hold,
porn.
sorry, yeah. So I just want to stress that for a sec because I work with a lot of porn addicts,
Mhm.
and they're trying to quit. They're trying to get off it, and
Mhm.
uh, we talk about what have you told yourself about pornography, or how have you lied to
Yeah.
yourself? Because all addicts lie to themselves, right?
Mhm.
And always I hear, among other things, it's no big deal, and I'm not hurting anyone.
Yeah.
I'm not hurting anyone. Or and in their mind, like, they're detached from what's happening on the other side of the screen. But and I say, well, let's tweak that a little bit to, are you participating in something in which anyone is being harmed?
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
And of course, the sole reason this all exists in the first place is men demand it.
Yeah.
Supply and demand. But just to clarify, what you're saying is, in the actual making and production of pornography, it is so emotionally, physically, sexually, and psychologically abusive that people literally have to get out after a period of a few months.
Yes, it's a
Yeah.
very common story that often the recruiting path into pornography starts with strip clubs, with
Right.
women who are
Get
dancing,
recruited out of that, right?
right?
Mhm.
And then they go, it's changed a lot, but at one point, most of the porn production in the US was in the San Fernando Valley in
Yeah,
California.
yeah,
So
yeah.
you go to the valley, right? Well, of course, there's no services for women who are in this industry. There's no help. And if they get out, the last thing in the world they want to do is let it be known that they were in the porn industry. In fact, I've talked to many of these women who live for the rest of their lives terrified that someone they know will
We'll
see,
see. Yeah,
right?
we'll see
Let me
the
let,
video.
let me tell you a quick story. You mentioned some of the research I did. It included going to the annual pornography industry convention in Las
Oh yeah,
Vegas.
talk about that. That chapter is unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah, I went 3 years and it was hard. It was traumatic in a certain way to see the open celebration of the sexualized abuse of women in a huge convention center with thousands of people.
In public, like, this is a public setting, right? Like,
It's
anyone can go and buy tickets and go in, right?
Yeah, it's in Las Vegas in the biggest convention center and a very popular tourist destination. Well, I was interviewing, as I said, directors and producers. I was also interviewing women in the porn industry.
Wow. Okay.
And one of the things they did at that convention was to sign pictures for their fans.
Sure.
And
Right.
so I was sitting with a young woman who was in her early 20s, uh, who was already a porn veteran. And she had had a hard night drinking and she was kind of hungover. And we
Uh,
were just chatting. She wasn't a big star. So the line for her pictures wasn't quite as long.
Mm.
And she was willing to talk, and we were chatting about her life in the industry, and all of a sudden she got panicked. She looked very scared.
Oh,
And after that group of men left, I said, "Are you okay? Because I noticed you seemed distressed at a certain point." And she said, "One of those guys who just came up went to high school with me." And she was
wow.
immediately filled with shame that someone she knew from her non-pornographic life would
Yeah.
now see her in this context.
Mhm.
Now, I don't think that's because she has, sex negative problems or she's internalized shame. I think it was that moment where she had to come to terms with her life and who she had become in the porn industry. And that's a very common kind of story. And as you wander around the porn convention, those kind of things happened all the time. Here's another story I tell in the book is uh, the security guards there police the porn booths. Each pornography production company has a booth, and of course they want to attract men to their booth to sell their products. So they encourage the pornography performers in their booth to be sexually explicit in public right there, kissing
Yeah.
each other and that kind of thing. And the convention polices that because they don't want to have any legal problems. But at the end of one of those days, I was part of a group at a booth, and two women in that booth were really becoming much more explicit in their behavior.
Mhm.
And the crowd started pressing forward and calling for more, take it off.
Mhm. Mhm.
And one woman especially was really responding to that, performing. Uh, and I felt the mood of this group of men, maybe 30, 40 men,
Yeah.
really turn ugly. And I realized, and I was stuck in the middle of it. I couldn't get out.
Right.
And I realized in another setting, this would be a gang rape. I was in that
Mhm.
setting, and anybody who's a guy has been in certain all male settings where you feel that hostility and that anger and that
Right.
sense of entitlement really come out. And I was afraid. I was afraid for the
Yeah.
woman, and I was afraid for myself. I had no idea what was about to happen.
Like a mob, I think you said in the
It
book, right? Like
it
it felt
was
like a mob.
it felt like a
Mind.
mob that was ready to engage in gang rape. Well,
Yeah.
that's just run-of-the-mill behavior in the porn industry. That's what we're talking about. So go back to your point in your conversations with men who are addicted to porn.
Mhm.
Uh, they want to say nobody's getting hurt, but that's clearly not true. And when you're using pornography, you have no idea the conditions under which that pornographic film was made, right?
Something
There,
I something I point out to them.
right.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
porn industry isn't going to, include scenes where women are crying because they're so emotionally distraught after the sex.
They edit
They're,
that out, don't they?
yeah, they're not going to show you the consequences of this.
Mhm.
And so when men use pornography, they have no idea the conditions under which it's been used. It's the same with men who use women in prostitution. Even
Right.
if the woman in prostitution says, "I'm here of my own free choice and I enjoy this work," you have no way of knowing whether that's true. So whenever men engage with what I call the sexual exploitation industries, pornography, prostitution, stripping,
Mhm.
massage parlors, escorts, the whole business, you have no way of knowing the conditions under which those women made those choices. And you can know for sure that abuse is a consistent feature of
Yes.
those industries.
Yeah.
That's a moral question. And this has come up in other settings. When we use products that are made with child labor, for
Gotcha.
instance,
Yeah.
right, we are asked to reflect on our moral responsibility
Mhm.
to children being exploited, right?
Yes.
Sweatshop labor, all of these things. These are questions we should be asking ourselves. But of course, the porn industry desperately wants to make sure men never ask that question. And that's why the porn girls love it trope is so common, right?
Mhm.
The industry puts up an image of women enjoying the work. And, there are some very well-known women who've done this, who've been kind of the PR face of the porn industry. And I want to make it clear, I'm not telling those women what they should think or feel.
Mhm.
I'm saying that those women that the porn industry puts up for public relations purposes are not representative of all the women who are used in pornography production. That's all.
And I'm curious, like, how many porn performers, for lack of a better word, how many did you speak to, do you think, in total? Like just half a dozen, or?
Oh, several dozen over those.
Oh, okay, so
trips.
I'm curious, did you get that sort of consistent narrative, like the party line, oh, I love it, it's great, right? Or did they ever get to the place where they're comfortable with you, where you sort of peek behind the curtain and they were like, you know what, Robert, this is freaking hell, and I just want to get out of here. Like, what did you see?
When you present yourself as a researcher on pornography with a feminist critique, of course, it's hard to even get people to talk to you. But in those,
you're a what? Who? What do you do?
But at those industry conventions, which again were very much about the public presentation of pornography as harmless fun, you're right that most of the women I spoke to kept that public relations line, although sometimes when they were alone, when there was nobody listening, they would tell you. A better source of information is actually women who have left the industry. Right. Now, as I said, it's difficult to identify women who've left the industry because most of them don't want to dredge up the experience for perfectly understandable reasons.
Did you talk to any of those women though? And
yeah, I've read the accounts that many of those women have published. And it's not just women in pornography, but also women used in prostitution who get out. And what they say is fairly consistent. I'll tell you what one woman told me. She had been a stripper. She had her work in the sexual exploitation industries had been in strip bars. And she said, you know, when I was stripping, I would have told you that I was in control of my own sexuality. I was making a free choice. I enjoyed the money I was making, and I was in control of those men. They weren't in control of me. And she said, what I wouldn't have been able to tell you at that point is that I was either drunk or high almost every time I went on stage.
Right.
And she said, I had not yet come to terms with my history of childhood sexual trauma.
Right.
Which is a consistent feature of women in the sexual exploitation industries, disproportionately high rates of drug and alcohol abuse, and disproportionately high rates of childhood sexual assault. And why that's so important to people who understand the dynamics of child sexual assault is it has a profound influence on how you see yourself, your body, and your own worth.
Yes.
And it is not uncommon for people who've had that experience to think of themselves as really being worthy only when they are providing sexual pleasure for others. All right. Now, I'm not saying that's every woman in the sexual exploitation industries, but again, we're looking at patterns. And again, men have to face the fact that when they choose to use these products or these women, they are using women who have experienced those traumas. All right. So that's the industry as it is. Now, you know, you asked if it was traumatic for me. Again, I never want to present a false equivalence as if, you know, the experience I had was anything like the experience of women in the porn industry. But it was emotionally devastating to immerse myself in that industry for the 2 or 3 years that I was working on the book and working also on a documentary film.
Well, I think you mentioned at one point in the book, like you just had enough one night and just kind of broke down and cried. And I know for myself, I had to stop kind of like researching or learning about this stuff a few years ago. I have to really limit it now because, you know, all you got to do is, like, I was just reading a little bit of the chapter on the content of the porn and the women describe, and I literally feel sick. You know, I feel sick to my stomach, and I have to take a break. So, you know, that's why I asked that, because I mean, you were right there exposing yourself to that. So I imagine you paid a price for that. It took a toll on you.
You know, I did stop research at the end of that book project. I was finishing a review of pornographic videos, and I just said enough. I know as much as I need to know, and I'm actually endangering my own mental health by this.
Wow.
And so, you know, and again, I had friends and colleagues I could talk through this with. So again, it's nothing like the trauma that's experienced by women in the industry, but it is a reminder that this stuff is traumatic in general. It's made under conditions that create trauma, and the constant exposure to it can be traumatic. And there's kind of a flip side to that. It also can, for men who are habitual users, whether we talk about that as addiction or not, there's a big debate in psychology about that. But there is clearly a pattern of men who use pornography habitually, right?
Yeah.
They sometimes say, I wish I could quit, but I can't. Sounds a lot like addiction to me too, right? Their own sexual imaginations become so conditioned to those images that I've had men tell me they can't become sexually aroused without pornography. I've had men tell me that.
I hear that regularly. Yeah.
I've had men tell me they can't have sex with a partner if they're not thinking of pornography.
Same
And of
here.
course, there's now a documented increase in erectile dysfunction of men not even being able to sustain an erection without pornography. Well,
Yeah.
those are real world consequences for men. Again, they're not as dramatic as the real world consequences for women, but they are, or should be, an incentive for men to step back, to critique their own use for their own self-interest, as well as in the interests of women and girls. In other words, if you can look honestly at the contemporary porn industry, the conditions under which it's made, the products it produces, and the effects on users, it's hard to imagine an argument for the porn industry, right? The effects are negative.
To justify its existence, isn't it?
Right. There's only one justification for the porn industry,
Money.
and that is profit. It makes an extraordinary amount of money. Right now, those revenue streams have changed a lot, and my friend Gail Dines has done the best work on this. The shift from originally movie theaters to VHS to DVD to online has changed the way porn makes money, and it's changed who makes money in porn, but people still make a lot of money in porn. And that's a reminder that, in a capitalist economy, moral considerations tend to get sidelined in the quest for profits. And so, I've said that pornography is an important industry to look at on 3 different criteria.
Okay.
The one we've been talking about primarily is the feminist critique of patriarchy, the way that it sexualizes male dominance. Well, it also sexualizes racism. Pornography is without question the most overtly racist media genre in the world today.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I don't,
a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't mean just subtle racist, images. I mean out and out old style.
Racism. Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking, 19th century racism here. And why is that? Well, Gail actually helped me understand this about 25 years ago. Why would pornography be so racist? And I think the answer is actually pretty simple. Pornography is about sexualizing power and domination. And one of the ways people can express power and domination is through racism. So if you have, a porn industry that uses white women in a certain way, but then presents Latinas as even more, the hot-blooded Latina stereotype.
Right.
Or it presents Asian women as the classic kind of geisha girl. These racist stereotypes about women, especially Latina, Asian, and Black women, right, are throughout pornography. You won't have any trouble finding them. There's another genre.
Why is that though? That's so.
Well, think of it this way. Pornography sells its products to men by promising an intense sexual experience. The intensity of that experience is not just about the graphic sexuality. At some point, if you've seen people having sex in a fairly traditional sort of quote unquote normal way, it gets old pretty quickly, right? And so the industry has to constantly, and I'll use quotes here too, innovate new kinds of ways to create that sexual charge for the primarily male consumers.
Yeah.
And it does it through cruelty and abuse of women, but it also does it by sexualizing racism. Pornography will sexualize any power disparity that exists in the world, because some component of the primarily male consumer base will find that more erotic. Right. So you get You get racism sexualized. You get age sexualized. There's also a huge explosion in the amount of pornography that is not explicitly child pornography, right? It's not pornography using children.
Yeah.
What we now refer to as child sexual exploitation material, which is a much more direct way of child pornography makes it sound like something kids do, right? And there's been a change in terminology, and a very good one, to call those kinds of films and pictures child sexual exploitation materials, because all they are is a documentation of child abuse, basically.
Well, it's more accurate. It's always better to be more precise than less precise, right?
Right. So those child sexual exploitation materials are illegal everywhere.
Yeah.
They're traded underground, but the porn industry, the legal porn industry, it doesn't use children. It's very afraid of that because of the legal consequences. What it does is it creates what my friend Gail calls pseudo child pornography. So it uses very young looking women. They may be 18, but they might look 14.
Yeah.
They tend to be petite, small breasts, looking more like children.
Right.
And they put them in classic, Catholic school uniforms or cheerleader outfits.
Tails, teddy bears.
There is an extraordinary expansion of that. Well, why? Because most men are pedophiles? No, but because the exploitation of children is another way to signal power, right? And there's an incredible explosion of this. And genres that if people were aware of, I think would really scare them. For instance, there's a huge, what's sometimes called incest porn. The typical film presents a stepfather and a stepdaughter, right, in a sexual situation. We live in a culture in which, and I'll say this bluntly, but politely, we live in a culture in which a large number of men routinely achieve sexual satisfaction through masturbation by watching images of women being subjected to cruel and degrading sexual acts that are sometimes racist in characterization and sometimes sexualize adults preying on children. That's the world we live in. Now,
summarized. Yeah.
And if people say, well, you're trying to scare people, my response is, I'm not trying to scare people. I'm scared. I'm scared when...
Very word as well.
Right? So let's also now talk about access, because what's changed in the pornography industry is not only the technology and not only the intensity of these highly abusive images, but of course, access has changed. Yes. So, I said I grew up as a child and a young man using pornography. When I was a kid, pornography meant, going into the dumpster behind the drugstore to find old issues of Playboy. Literally, that's what we did.
Or your dad's closet under the bed.
Okay.
Your friends had it.
Now, I'm not saying that was harmless or trivial, right? I think there are real questions about even that level of access. But imagine now you have prepubescent boys with ready access to the internet with virtually no control, either from parents or the culture or the industry.
On this.
Right? Not only sitting at home, but now, of course, with mobile devices, which means the effects of this are not only on these boys viewing it, and we should also point out an increasing number of girls viewing it as well, but it's also now out in the culture in a way that boys can take into, mixed gender spaces. You can be in school, you can be in the lunchroom with girls at the table while you're streaming porn on your mobile device.
And this is happening, Robert, all over the place.
Right. Now, what are the consequences of this? Well,
glad you asked, because I'm also, this is on my mind a lot. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, Gail, my friend Gail Dines, I keep referring to Gail because her work is so central.
Now that I've had you on here, I can convince her to do an interview with me.
I think you'd really, Gail's insights are really quite powerful.
I'd love to have her. Yeah.
Right. But Gail says, what the internet age has done is subjected this culture to one great social experiment that nobody has consented to. And the
Right.
experiment asks this question: what happens when you flood a culture with this kind of sexual material? Right?
Yes.
We are living
Yes.
through an unregulated sexual experiment, in a sense.
Yeah.
Well, what are the consequences? Well, some things we know with the evidence available. So I've spoken to one of them, which is the effects on women used in the porn industry. We
Right.
also know that is a similar effect to women who are used in prostitution, right? And I'm going to drive that home with one statistic that is, I think, really powerful. A psychologist did a study based on women in street prostitution.
Okay.
And this was a clinical psychologist, someone with great experience.
Yeah.
And she found that I think it was 68% of the women she interviewed met the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder because of their work in prostitution.
Yes.
Now that's a higher
incredible.
level of PTSD than you'll find in
And
soldiers, police
soldiers.
officers.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
other words, the work of being prostituted is
The most traumatic.
traumatic.
Yeah.
And you use the term multi-traumatic is the phrase. Now, these are women often, they don't have much access to education. They don't have economic resources. They have, as I said, elevated levels of drug and alcohol abuse. They have
Yes.
disproportionately high rates of childhood sexual abuse experiences.
Mhm.
All right. That's one consequence of this world. The other you've also spoken to in your work with men, which is an addictive-like relationship to pornography
Mhm.
that produces the consequences we talked about.
Yeah.
The thing that's harder to gauge is what is the effect on women, if we're talking about heterosexual porn, which we've been speaking about. There's, of course, a thriving gay porn market.
Yeah.
There's a much smaller lesbian porn market. But if we're going to stay to the heterosexual market,
Mhm.
the other question, which is harder to study, is what are the effects on men's expectations of sexual behavior from female partners? In
Mm.
other words, men who are raised on a steady diet of this porn, what does that mean when they become sexually active? Well, the way I'll highlight the importance of this comes from uh, a comment made by a woman who was a sexual educator and worked with college students. So her primary group she worked with was young men coming to college, 18,
Right.
19, 20 years old.
Yeah. Good age group.
And in an article, she said that she tells these young men that on a first date with a woman, again, we're in a heterosexual context. She said, in a first date, I tell these young men to not choke women, to not try to have anal sex with women, and to not ejaculate on their face. Okay, so let's pause for a minute. You might say to yourself, well, on a first date, isn't it kind of common sense that you don't try to choke a woman?
Or on any date.
Yeah.
Or ever.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That
Mhm.
these are just not things that people would think.
Mhm.
Maybe, if that was a sexual preference of yours, you would talk to somebody. But the idea that on a first date, you would have to be told that these are inappropriate actions,
Well,
why would that be?
compared to our generations, you're 62, I'm 52. It
Yeah.
was probably like you don't hold hands
Yeah.
till the third day,
Okay. Well,
right?
where would that come from?
Yeah.
Well, what are some of the common pornographic sexual practices? Well, there's a very, common genre of men choking women during sex,
Yes.
where the women then say, I like it, choke me. Okay.
Yeah.
So these are young men who've been raised on a diet of pornography, which includes choking.
Mhm.
Anal intercourse is routine in pornography, right? Now, anal intercourse also exists in the non-pornographic world too, but men know that the vast majority of heterosexual women don't seek out anal sex, right?
Right.
And ejaculating on a woman's face is the ultimate pornographic practice.
Right.
So I think in the comment of that woman who's doing sex education with the pornographic generation, the boys raised on this material with ready access to it through the internet,
Yeah.
right? The fact that she has to make those comments tells you something about behavior. All right.
Yes.
Now, whenever we're talking about the effects of media on human behavior, whether it's pornography or violent video games or violent movies, I'm always cautious because it's, establishing cause and effects relationships in human behavior is difficult.
Mhm.
But I think we have enough evidence now to suggest that men's sexual behavior when they are longtime habitual pornography users has changed as a result
Absolutely.
of that use.
100%.
And the most, I think, compelling testimony to that is the testimony of women who talk about what it's like to date young men in this culture. And I think that's something we don't want to lose sight of, that for all of the sexual and emotional dysfunction in men that comes from this pornography use, it also has a dramatic effect on women who are in the dating world, again, talking in a heterosexual context. Let me tell you a story about that ties a lot of this together.
Sure.
I had a student who was asking me about my work on pornography. This is about 10 years ago. And I explained what I've done. And she said, that's really old people's concerns. She said, those of us in the younger generation, we don't get so worked up about porn. She said, yeah, porn is everywhere, but I just don't really care about it. And I said, really? And I said, let me ask you a question. She had indicated to me she was heterosexual and that she dated, right? She was out in the dating world. And I said, imagine this, you have two men who are interested in dating you, right? And they're pretty much equivalent, whatever you value, good looks, sense of humor, smart, whatever, they're pretty much equal. In other words, if you looked at these two guys, they would look like equally intriguing potential dates. I said, what if the only difference between them was one was a habitual porn user who masturbated to pornography on a regular basis, and the other one didn't use porn? I said, who would you want to date?
I love how you set that up, because
And
I bet she answered the non-user, right?
Well, she kind of grimaced a bit, and she said, well, to be honest, I'd rather go out with the guy who doesn't use porn. And I said, but you just told me porn isn't a big deal.
Right.
I said, I'm not, I wasn't trying to be, mean to her.
No, it's a thought experiment, though.
Let's
think of it this way, right?
Yeah. And that reflects what I've heard from many women, especially younger women, is that I don't like porn, they say. I wish I could find men to date who don't use porn, but I've given up because I've never met a guy who doesn't use porn.
I've heard that too. Yeah.
Right. And so some women are trying to change that. There's something called the no porn pledge, where women say, I won't date men unless they agree to stop using porn. Right.
Okay.
So, so the question, what effect does this have on the culture? Well, the effects are across the board in all sorts of ways, from the really life-threatening effects for the women in the industry to the way it has sort of quietly over time produced a very, what I would call a kind of sexually corrosive culture, where the routine way in which men get sexual pleasure from the humiliation, degradation, and outright abuse of women has become so commonplace that people kind of shrug and accept it. Not only shrug and accept it, but as you pointed out, sometimes defend and celebrate it as a great sexually liberating force. Well, I think when you actually look at people's experiences, you look at the data, you look at the studies that have been done, there are some patterns. And again, we're not trying to describe everybody's experience as if it's the same.
Yeah.
Those patterns are clear, that pornography has become increasingly cruel and degrading to women and increasingly racist over the last 3 decades, that the effects of pornography on men's perception or men's experience of their own sexuality is often dramatically negative. Its effect on women's sexual experience is often dramatically negative. And of course, what we don't know, and is really hard to study, is what effect does this have on just the general level of sexual violence in the culture, right? I mean, if you expose generation after generation of young men to this, does their conception of what actually constitutes rape change? After all, if you see video after video of women who pretend to enjoy being choked and humiliated, that does become normal. And what does that mean to your understanding of what sexual abuse, sexual assault, sexual harassment actually are? Now, we're at a kind of interesting moment in history where there's heightened awareness about things like rape and sexual harassment. The Me Too movement has done a lot to heighten everybody's awareness. But at the same time that the Me Too movement is raising these issues, the pornographic culture continues with very little critique. The anti-porn movement is small. It's making some headway, but it's very small. That's the complicated world we live in. And, you know, we're adults and we struggle to understand and cope with it. I really wonder how children can make sense of the culture in which they live. And here I mean both boys and girls. If you're raised in this culture, right, where men are being socialized to be sexually aggressive and women are socialized to objectify themselves and present themselves as sexual objects to men, what does that do to the psychology, the social development of children? Well, we don't know, but there's plenty of reasons to be very concerned about this.
No, that's great. You've covered most of the talking points that I had. Maybe with about 5 to 8 minutes left, what would your message be? A lot of guys watching my channel will be possibly men, some women, but mostly men, coming to grips that their relationship to porn is highly problematic, trying to quit. What would your message be to them?
Well, really 2 or 3 different things. One is, don't be afraid of feminist politics.
Okay.
Right? Like, don't be afraid to pick up Andrea Dworkin's book and read it. Don't be afraid to pick up the work of Gail Dines, my friend and colleague. Don't be afraid to look at the world honestly. And feminism is your guide to that, right? Not something to be afraid of.
Okay.
Second, I think where appropriate, therapy is really important, right? That when people are struggling and have levels of depression or sexual dysfunction, I think therapy can be very helpful. But beyond therapy, I think men have to connect with each other. It's not enough to go to a psychotherapist on this. Men have to be willing to connect and talk with each other. When men ask me, how do I quit porn? I say, I don't know. There's not a single way to do it, but I can tell you one thing. If you try to do it alone, you will fail. The stories of men who commit saying, I'm not going to use porn anymore, but they won't get help and they won't reveal their struggle to other men.
Yes.
They never can sustain it.
You're bang on, Robert.
It's very difficult, right?
Yeah.
And if you think about it, anything to do that's hard is hard to do alone, right? I mean, that's just a kind of rule of life, right? If you're an alcoholic, does anyone suggest that an alcoholic should deal with that problem alone?
No, the
opposite. To not seek competent medical and therapeutic help, to not go to a group. Right? Nobody expects us to deal with difficult problems in modern living by ourselves. And this is the same. I can reflect on my own experience, and I always try to bring it back to that. I don't ever want it to appear that I'm preaching from on high. I have lived through this myself. When I was a young man in my 20s, when pornography was much less readily available, much less dramatically, fused to male power, I would visit, let's say, a pornographic movie theater, and I would feel shame. I would feel bad afterwards, and I would say to myself, "I'm not going to do that anymore."
Yeah.
But eventually, I would end up.
Words, right?
But eventually, I would end up back at that theater. Well, what helped me move out of that was, as I said, a feminist politics, therapy, and male friends I could trust.
Right.
And one of the things that I think it's always important to say is, for all the male bonding activities, the kind of typical frat boy, I love you, bro, kind of talk, men are terrified of each other in this culture.
We don't connect very well. No.
Men are afraid of trusting each other. Men are afraid that they will be the one who becomes the butt of the joke.
Mhm.
Right? And establishing that level of trust with other men is really important. I think it's one of the most important things we can do. And
Yeah.
for those of us who are older, especially, to try and model that for younger men and boys,
Mhm.
as confusing as it was for me to grow up in the world I grew up in, the 1960s, 70s,
Mhm.
it's far more difficult for boys today. And we
Yeah.
have to be willing to talk about this. And that means, as you point out, also revealing not only um, why we are such great guys now,
Mhm.
but talking about our own struggles, our own failures, reflecting on our own relationships and where we failed. Uh, and that's an ongoing process. That doesn't stop. You don't get woke and then all of a sudden you don't have problems anymore. I'm
Yeah.
62 years old. I'm in a very healthy relationship with a very loving partner, and I still struggle, right? Not
Right.
with using porn and not with certain kinds of behaviors, but I struggle to make sure that I'm clear about what it means to be a decent human being in relationship with another person and what intimacy can be. Right? That's a
Yeah.
lifelong
Yeah.
path. And
Wonderfully said.
yeah,
Wonderfully said. Yeah.
and it's joyful. And I don't
Yeah.
want to end on a downer note. I said
Well,
it's a struggle, but it's a very joyful struggle.
right. Well,
And when
it's
you
meaningful struggle, right? And
that's a,
that's what gives, I think,
yeah,
our purposeful struggle is what gives our lives meaning as much, maybe more than anything else. One last quick thing, Robert. Your message to those who are with someone who's using porn. So let's just, for the sake of, it could be same-sex couples, but
yeah.
let's say it's a woman living with a man who's using porn compulsively. What might you say to her?
Well, it's hard to give advice when people are struggling, but I think the most important thing is for women to recognize that their discomfort with pornography and their partner's use of pornography
Mhm.
is not a problem they have. They
Thank
have to
you.
deal with the
Yes.
problem, but it's not
It's
their
not
point of
them.
view. It's
Mhm.
not them. It's not that they're, prudish or frigid or sex
Yep.
negative,
Yep.
right? They're not against sex. They're
Yes.
against abusive sex and the use of sex to close down and numb out, because that's what a lot of women experience, of course, is their partners become emotionally more remote because
Yes.
their sexual imagination is so captured by pornography. So the first and most important thing is to say, you're okay. Your reaction is very sensible, sane, and emotionally healthy.
Yes.
From there, some women will eventually need to exit a relationship with a man who does not express any willingness to struggle. Uh, for men who are willing to engage in therapy, to consider a feminist critique, then women have a choice to stay with the relationship. And those are judgments no one can make for another person. But the main thing is to put it in more blunt terms to women. You're not crazy.
Right.
This stuff is abusive. It's
Yeah.
damaging
Mhm.
across the board,
Yeah.
and stay true to yourself. The other thing, and this is even more important, is to encourage women to connect with other women in a feminist context.
Mm.
That just as men need the support of other men to challenge this, that's how feminism came to be. Women coming together and saying that the conditions of their everyday life were not acceptable,
Mhm.
right? And this is what in second wave feminism was called consciousness raising, right? Women coming together to understand the world through sharing their own experiences, and that is so important.
Right. Well said. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great.
Okay, Robert, I really appreciate you sharing your expertise, your insights, your experiences. This was a great conversation. And thank you for the work you've done. Thank you for the books you've written, for the critiques you've made, for your insight, and for speaking up about this. Like you said, the group of people discussing this is relatively like tiny. And I would really love to see, as I'm sure you would too, this conversation, expanding significantly over the next, decade or so. I think that's probably what it's going to take to really shift public consciousness about this. But I'm hopeful that we can.
Great.
So enjoy your weekend and stay in touch. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Paul. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.